Pack what fits in one bag, Coralie. The rest stays. Fenwick Aldgate, 44-year-old CEO of Aldgate Meridian Properties and husband of 11 years, said it from the top of the staircase at Ashvale House, the stone manor outside Calgary, that Coralie had turned from a draughty inheritance into a home worth showing. Below him stood Prudence Aldgate, 67-year-old matriarch of the Aldgate family and controlling voice in every room she entered, already holding the keys to the front gate the way a judge holds a gavel, with pleasure and with practice. Coralie Dufresne Aldgate, 37-year-old wife and daughter of the late Rémy Dufresne, stood in the entrance hall in a coat she hadn't meant to put on yet. Rain moved across the stone terrace outside the tall windows. Her one good suitcase sat by the door. Paloma Keyes, 29-year-old brand director at Aldgate Meridian Properties, and the woman Fenwick had been hiding with varying degrees of carelessness for the better part of a year, descended the far staircase wearing a cashmere wrap that belonged to Coralie. She smiled at no one in particular, but the smile landed everywhere. "A woman who really belongs in a family," Paloma said softly, "doesn't need to be told to stay." Coralie looked at Fenwick. He looked at the rolled floor plan under his arm. The Harrow Point development project, the one he'd been showing investors all week, the one the whole company was built on right now. He did not look at her. "The arrangement is clean," he said. "Nolan's office will send papers tomorrow. Sign them early and this stays quiet." Coralie didn't scream. She didn't beg or threaten or cry in front of Paloma. She looked at the house around her. At the window she'd resealed herself one February when the contractor didn't show. At the staff she'd kept on payroll through 3 bad quarters by quietly moving money she'd never asked credit for. At the portrait of her father hanging at the east end of the hall, his eyes patient and just a little amused. She picked up her suitcase and walked out into the rain. What Fenwick did not know, what he had never cared enough to ask, was that Coralie's late father, Rémy Dufresne, had not only left her money, he had left her to trust. Dufresne Land Holdings Trust, established quietly during the last years of his life, protected by a provincial registration that used her maiden name, not her married one. The trust held the controlling interest in a provincial title and development certificate authority that Rémy had built through 30 years of patient, unglamorous work. Not a bank, not a media company. Something less visible and far more essential. The entity that certified land titles and development compliance documents across 3 western provinces, including the authorizations required to break ground on any project above a certain threshold, including Harrow Point. Fenwick had signed the prenuptial disclosure when they married. His lawyer had walked him through a single paragraph describing Dufresne Land Holdings Trust. Fenwick had laughed and called it old country paperwork. He signed without reading past the first page. 11 years later, standing in a rain-wet parking lot outside Ashvale House with one suitcase, Coralie understood something for the first time with full clarity. Her silence had not protected her marriage. It had only delayed the moment Fenwick revealed what he valued when he thought she had nothing. She called Rosamond Fair. Rosamond Fair, 51-year-old litigation partner and the attorney Rémy Dufresne had trusted with family matters for 15 years, arrived at the hotel within 2 hours. She did not ask if Coralie was all right. She sat across from her at the small desk, read the preliminary divorce document Fenwick's office had emailed before Coralie's coat was dry, and placed one finger on a single clause near the bottom of page 4. Wife confirms she holds no direct, indirect, or beneficial interest in any regulatory, certification, or title entity connected to the development and land use obligations of the husband's business, and waives all rights to review, challenge, or disclose such connections. Rosamond looked up. They wrote this clause themselves. Yes, Coralie said. They wouldn't write it unless they were afraid of it. That sentence steadied something Coralie hadn't been able to name since walking out the door. Rosamond took out a legal pad. Tell me everything about Dufresne Land Holdings Trust, from the beginning. Coralie opened her secure tablet. The screen lit up with the trust portal, her maiden name at the top of the account in clean letters. Rémy Dufresne, founding trustee. Coralie Dufresne, successor trustee and controlling beneficiary. Rosamond went very still. Does Fenwick know? He knows my father built a land title business. He thinks it was sold to a Calgary investment group after my father died. Coralie set the tablet on the table between them. It wasn't. Why didn't you tell him? Coralie looked at the window. The rain had stopped, but the glass was still streaked with it. She thought about a dinner early in their marriage, sitting next to a woman in her 60s who'd sold 3 companies and spoken about it without any fanfare. Fenwick had leaned to Coralie afterward and said, "Women with real money are exhausting. They always want you to be impressed." She'd been holding her wine glass, ready to tell him about the trust. She'd set the glass down instead. "My father told me not to," she said. "Not until I was sure he respected me for something other than what I own." Rosamond studied her. Then she clicked her pen once. "We need to talk about the Harrow Point development." The Harrow Point Residences project was the largest in Aldgate Meridian's history, a mixed-use development on the edge of a protected river corridor outside Edmonton, approved in principle by the municipality, but requiring a formal land certification sign-off before construction could begin. That sign-off had to come from a recognized provincial title authority. Dufresne Land Holdings Trust was one of 3 such authorities in the province. Coralie had known this for 2 years. She had stayed completely removed from any file touching Aldgate Meridian, not because Fenwick deserved her protection, but because the process deserved to be clean. If anything was ever formally reviewed, the record had to show no conflict. She had insisted on that wall herself. Tanner Blaise, 41-year-old Chief Financial Officer of Aldgate Meridian, and the most visibly nervous person on the company's executive floor, had called Coralie twice in the past 3 months. Not to ask for help, to ask, in barely coded language, whether she had any connections who might smooth the certification timeline. She had answered both calls in 2 sentences and said nothing useful. She understood now why he'd been afraid. Rosamond arranged a preliminary meeting. When they arrived, Tanner sat in the corner of the conference room, looking like someone who had already measured the distance to the exit. Fenwick came in with his usual practiced confidence, suit immaculate, the slight smile he used when he expected to negotiate his way through something. Prudence sat beside him, pearls and pressed linen, hands folded as if she were chairing the room. Their lawyer, Sutcliffe, opened a leather folder and slid the divorce settlement across the table. Paloma was not required to be there. She came anyway. Coralie looked at the document. Then she looked at Rosamond. "She won't sign today," Rosamond said. Fenwick's composure tightened. "Be reasonable, Coralie." "I am being completely reasonable. That's what's bothering you." Sutcliffe cleared his throat. "The settlement is generous given the—" "It has a clause about certification entities," Rosamond said. "Standard language doesn't exclude regulatory bodies by category. This clause was written specifically." She slid the page back. "Why?" Tanner's knuckle went white on his pen. Fenwick stood. "This is harassment." "You filed the paperwork," Rosamond said. "You chose the language." Prudence lifted her chin. "Coralie has never been involved in Fenwick's business. She kept the house. That was her contribution." Rosamond wrote something on her pad. "We'll note that." Coralie looked at Paloma. Paloma met her eyes, then looked away first. The divorce papers, the clause, the prenuptial disclosure, and 11 years of personal financial records arrived on Rosamond's desk within 48 hours. Coralie spread them across the hotel room table and worked through them the way her father had taught her, slowly, with a highlighter, looking not for what was said but for what was missing. What was missing was significant. Clement Orban, 64-year-old estate manager at Ashvale House and one of 3 staff members who had never once treated Coralie like a guest in her own home, messaged her on a private line that night. He had worked for Rémy Dufresne before he worked for the Aldgates. He knew where the estate files were kept. What he sent her took an hour to read through. The first document was an expense record. Aldgate Meridian company accounts had been used to fund what was classified as Brand Environment Consulting, which turned out to be a redesigned apartment in a Beltline building, billed to a client hospitality budget. The apartment was registered to a numbered company. Paloma Keys was a director of that company. The second document was a certification application submitted to Dufresne Land Holdings Trust 6 months earlier. The signatory on the spousal disclosure section, the section confirming that the applicant's spouse had no connection to the certifying authority, bore a signature that was supposed to be Coralie's. She had not signed it. She looked at the signature for a long time. Her father had taught her to write the D in Dufresne open at the top, a small idiosyncrasy she'd inherited from watching him write. The signature on the document closed the D. The F crossed downward. Coralie's F always went up. She called Rosamond. "They submitted a false spousal disclosure to the trust," Coralie said. "To the certification authority I control." Rosamond was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Then we are no longer talking about a difficult divorce." By morning, the Harrow Point certification file had been flagged internally by Odessa Ewan, 44-year-old compliance director at Dufresne's Land Holdings Trust and one of the few executives who knew the full picture of the controlling beneficiary's identity. Odessa had noticed a discrepancy in the spousal disclosure 6 weeks earlier and placed the application on hold pending further documentation. She had not been able to tell Coralie directly, because Coralie had asked to be kept at arm's length from any Aldgate-related file. That distance no longer served any purpose. Coralie authorized Odessa to convene an independent review. Outside counsel was brought in. A document examiner was retained. Everything moved through proper channels, properly documented, with no fingerprint of personal anger anywhere on the process. That was the only way to make it stick. Meanwhile, Fenwick had no idea why his Harrow Point application had stopped moving. Tanner called the trust office twice and was told a documentation review was underway. He called Sutcliffe, who called someone else, who eventually reported back that a spousal certification issue had been raised. Fenwick called Coralie. She let it go to voicemail. He called again. She read the transcript her phone auto-generated and handed it to Rosamond without comment. In it, Fenwick said the words business, complicated, and misunderstanding in varying combinations for 4 minutes. He did not once say sorry. Prudence sent a written message through Sutcliffe's office stating that Coralie was deliberately impeding a significant economic development that employed dozens of Albertans and that her behavior was consistent with the vindictiveness that had made the marriage untenable. Rosamond filed the letter with the rest of the documentation and labeled it motive. The independent review took 9 days. At the end of it, the document examiner's report was 4 pages long and included a comparative analysis of 17 signature samples. It confirmed that the signature on the spousal disclosure was not Coralie's. It could not confirm who had signed it. It did not need to. The confirmation that the document was false was enough to freeze the application entirely. Harrow Point could not proceed. Tanner submitted a formal request for an urgent meeting with the certifying authority to resolve the compliance issue. Under trust policy, that meeting was scheduled through the director's office. Odessa scheduled it. Coralie reviewed the agenda. She understood what Fenwick expected: a junior administrator, a forms review, possibly an extension request. He expected to negotiate. He had spent his adult life negotiating his way around consequences with the confidence of someone who had never met a consequence that couldn't be softened with the right tone and a nice suit. He had married one of the people he should have been reading more carefully. The morning of the meeting, Rosamond arrived at the hotel at 7 with a pressed coat over her arm and a folder under each hand. She had not slept much. Her eyes were sharp anyway. "Remember what we decided," she said. Coralie took the coat. "Let them deny first. All 3 things. My contribution, their knowledge of the trust, the apartment." She looked at her reflection in the mirror above the desk. She wore no jewelry. The cashmere wrap was still wherever Paloma had left it. She didn't need it. "I know." Rosamond held the door. The Dufresne Land Holdings Trust boardroom occupied the 14th floor of a building in downtown Calgary, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the Bow River visible on a clear day, which this was. The long table was already set when Fenwick arrived with Tanner, Sutcliffe, Prudence, and a young associate carrying presentation boards about Harrow Point's economic benefits for the region. They were early. They were also alone in the room for exactly 4 minutes. Then the door opened. Odessa Ewan entered first. Behind her came Rosamond Fair. Behind Rosamond came Coralie Dufresne. Fenwick turned. The color left his face in stages. First the smugness, then the confidence, then something underneath both that Coralie had only seen in him once before, the morning he'd realized a major investor had pulled out and left him alone with his own decisions. Tanner sat down without being asked. Prudence stared at Coralie as if she were watching a piece of furniture stand up and introduce itself. Odessa spoke first for the record. "Thank you for attending. I'll note for the minutes that Coralie Dufresne is present in her capacity as successor trustee and controlling beneficiary of Dufresne Land Holdings Trust. Given that documents submitted to this trust bear her name, her presence is required for identity confirmation and conflict disclosure. All substantive decisions regarding the Harrow Point certification will be made by the Independent Review Committee." The young associate lowered the presentation boards very slowly. Fenwick found his voice. "Coralie, what is this?" It wasn't a question. It was something between panic and accusation, which Coralie recognized as the particular sound a man made when the ground beneath a performance disappeared. "A compliance review," she said. She sat at the far end of the table. "Which you requested." Sutcliffe moved quickly. "There must be some misunderstanding about the trust structure. Fenwick's wife, his former wife, has no operating role." "She's the controlling beneficiary," Odessa said. "She has been since her father's death. It's registered provincially. It's in the prenuptial disclosure your client signed." Sutcliffe opened his mouth and closed it. Prudence's composure was magnificent and entirely useless. Remy Dufresne's trust was dissolved. We were told. You were told what Fenwick assumed, Rosamond said. There's a difference. Odessa opened the first file on the table. Regarding the Harrow Point application, the spousal disclosure submitted 6 months ago contains a signature that our document examiner has determined is not Coralie Dufresne's. The application has been suspended pending legal review and referral. Fenwick leaned forward. That document was submitted by our legal office. It was signed with someone else's name, Coralie said. The room went quiet. Tanner closed his eyes. Fenwick turned to him. Tanner said nothing. He had made a decision in the last 9 days, and whatever it was, it showed on his face like a man who had already settled his account and was waiting for the numbers to confirm it. Odessa moved to the second matter. Our compliance review also identified that several expenses classified as business hospitality through Aldgate Meridian accounts appear to correspond to personal benefits received by a third party connected to the applicant. These have been referred to outside counsel for review. Paloma's apartment, the wardrobe invoices, the quarterly travel coded as client development. Coralie looked at the table while Odessa read the summary. She did not look at Fenwick. Then Fenwick did what she had known, on some level he would eventually do. He leaned toward her, his voice dropped, not gentle, calculated. Coralie, we can resolve this between us. You don't need to destroy 11 years. She finally looked at him, fully, the way she hadn't let herself look at him since the night she'd stood outside Ashvale House in the rain. You destroyed 11 years, she said. I'm just reading the record out loud. Sutcliffe put one hand on Fenwick's sleeve. Don't. Prudence made a sound low in her throat. You were always going to do this. You were always going to use whatever you could find.
Coralie turned to her.
I didn't find this. You walked me to the door with it. You wrote a clause into a divorce document that named the one thing you were afraid I owned, and then you handed me the papers. She paused. My father used to say that a liar always shows you what he's hiding by working too hard to block the door in front of it. Prudence had no answer. That was new. Odessa read the committee's recommendation. The Harrow Point certification was suspended indefinitely pending resolution of the false documentation issue and compliance review outcome. No further applications from Aldgate Meridian would be processed by the trust until the matter was referred and resolved. Fenwick pushed back from the table. Without that certification, Harrow Point can't break ground. Without Harrow Point, the company was already in trouble, Coralie said. Before this room, before I walked back in. She looked at Tanner, not Fenwick. He knows. Tanner looked at the window. The bridge financing was contingent on the certificate. Without it, the lenders have a trigger clause. He said it quietly, like a man confessing rather than reporting. We've been managing the timeline for 8 months. Fenwick turned on him. Tanner. I'm cooperating, Tanner said. He didn't look at Fenwick again. The weeks that followed moved the way collapse always moved, slowly at first, then all at once. The bridge lenders received notification of the suspended certification and triggered their review clause. A second financing partner, learning of the compliance referral, requested an independent audit before releasing further funds. The Harrow Point timeline became impossible. Investors who had taken Fenwick's confidence as a business plan began asking questions that required answers instead of charm. The false spousal disclosure was referred to the Provincial Law Society and regulatory authorities. The outside counsel handling the referral was careful and thorough and had no interest in what the Aldgate name had once meant in certain rooms. Sutcliffe resigned from representing the family 2 weeks after the boardroom meeting. Paloma retained a separate lawyer and issued a statement saying she had been unaware that benefits she received were improperly classified. When the compliance review identified the numbered company connecting the apartment to company funds, the statement became a document exhibit. The apartment lease was terminated. A list of company-funded assets was prepared by outside counsel and entered into the formal record. Paloma had no further public comment. Prudence moved to a smaller property in a neighborhood she'd once described as perfectly fine for people without options. Her lawyers were very busy. Clement sent Coralie a message when the Ashvale keys were formally transferred to receivership inventory. He said the East Garden had held up well and that the staff were glad to know who had actually been keeping the lights on all those years. Coralie did not hold a press conference. She did not post anything. She gave one interview 6 months later to a journalist writing about women in provincial land regulation, and in it she said almost nothing about Fenwick directly. She spoke about her father, about the patience required to build something that lasted, about the difference between loudness and authority. The journalist asked if she felt vindicated. Coralie thought about the morning she'd sat in a hotel room reading divorce papers designed to make her disappear. She thought about Fenwick at the top of the Ashvale staircase, so certain of the size of his own name. She thought about her father's voice years ago, in an empty boardroom after closing. The trust is not about wealth, Coralie. It's about knowing your own name when someone else is trying to replace it. Vindication is a loud word, she said. What I feel is clear. The interview ran on a Saturday. Rosamond sent a message that said only, "Your father would have liked that answer." Coralie read it in the new office she'd set up, 2 floors below the trust's boardroom, where she had begun spending 4 days a week. The work was mostly documentation, regulatory correspondence, and quarterly reviews, the kind of work her father had told her once that made the rest of the world possible without ever getting thanked for it. She understood that differently now than she had before Fenwick, before Ashvale, before the rain. The chair behind her desk was not the one she'd occupied for 11 years at someone else's table. It was not the chair Paloma had taken at dinner parties, not the one Prudence had dismissed with a wave, not the one Fenwick had assumed he could empty by handing her a document in a hallway. This chair had her maiden name on the building registration. It had her father's handwriting in the margins of the founding documents and her own handwriting in every decision made since. Nobody else had ever been sitting in it. She picked up her pen, opened the next file, and kept working.